optimization, which is to create a dedicated warehouse for each of the different user groups or work groups. To understand this a little bit better, let's have a look at this overview of how maybe the structure in our organization with using a data warehouse could look like. So here we can understand the structure, and then we can understand how we can implement those dedicated warehouses in a more easy way. So here in the middle we can see that we have a data warehouse, and note this is now a data warehouse, so the actual data that we are referring to here, and not the warehouses or virtual warehouses that we create in our Snowflake account. So this is the actual data warehouse, so the actual data, and this can be now accessed from different user groups, maybe different teams, different applications, different workloads. So for example, here we can have the BI team. They might want to set up some ETL processes and maybe set up some reporting. Then we might have some database administrators and maybe also some data scientists that have much more complex tasks. Maybe they need much more processing powers for their tasks, maybe compared to the database administrators. Maybe we have some applications that access the data and they have completely different needs. Maybe they have very fluctuating user demand. So therefore, it can make sense, of course, to just have dedicated warehouses for different user groups. So this is then only accessible by their specific team or this specific application. And like this, it can be beneficial to have the right size and the right type of our warehouse. So this is what we want to focus on. So how could we achieve this? So the steps could be that, of course, in the beginning, we want to identify the different departments or different user groups in our company. So for example, the marketing department, they can have a dedicated warehouse to use it across all of their locations, because this is maybe one work group, one team that has the same needs. So we can set up a dedicated warehouse for them because this is one type of workload, and like this we can set it up to their needs. And also we can have maybe a warehouse for the BI team or maybe for the data science team and so on. So here we can create like this a dedicated warehouse for each group that we identify and then assign it to the users so that they can use this warehouse. This is how we could do this. So this is in some way a very straightforward process, but there are still some important things that we of course might want to keep in mind. So some considerations that we should keep in mind. So what are those? First of all, we should be aware that we are not creating too many virtual warehouses. So if we set this up in a too fine granular way, we set up too many warehouses for all of the different people or different small teams, then we may end up not fully using those warehouses. So this means that we might want to frequently start them and suspend them, and this can also lead then to an inefficient use. And like this, we can also increase the costs unnecessarily. For example, even with an auto resume time and an auto suspension time of 10 minutes, if we frequently start and suspend the warehouses like this, then we can still increase the cost unnecessarily. So therefore, we should avoid making this too fine granular, so we can also group it for similar teams. So for a specific similar use cases or workloads, we can group it also. So like this, we don't need to spin it up or down again, and we also avoid to underutilize the warehouse. And also now as a second step, we can of course also just refine this over time. So we can regularly review this and also refine maybe our classification to make sure it remains appropriate, or we might want to also improve it. And also, of course, the workload and maybe the usage patterns are changing. So therefore, it might be required actually to adjust this over time of how we have set up our warehouse. All right. So creating a dedicated warehouse is important. We can do this by identifying the user groups, the workloads, and then create dedicated warehouses for them, assign the users accordingly, and we should also keep in mind to avoid too many warehouses and also review it and refine this classification over time. So that's it. And now we want to, of course, move from the theory to practice and see how we can create those dedicated warehouses in a practical way. So in this scenario, we assume that we have identified already two user groups. So we have the data scientists and the DBAs, so the database administrators, and we have decided that we want to set up two different warehouses for each of those groups. So we have in this case the first one, which is data science warehouse, and then the DBA warehouse. So they are different in the size. So the data scientists need a little bit of a larger one. So therefore we set the warehouse size here to small. And for the database administrators, we set it to extra small. So of course we know how to create a warehouse. We just use the command create warehouse, the name of the warehouse, and then width, and then we specify just the properties of this warehouse. So we say the type is a standard, we have the warehouse size is small, scaling policy is standard. So yeah, basically we set up a very normal warehouse. Auto-suspend is set here to 5 minutes or 300 seconds, auto-resume to true, and we set up just one cluster basically. So this is min and max is just one. So if we set up the warehouse like this, we can see that this will be easily created. And note, by the way, that I'm using here the account admin. Of course, ideally, we would use actually, and we talk about using the roles in the best way later on in this course when we talk about access management and security. But ideally, when we would set up a warehouse, we do this using the sysadmin, and then we can grant permissions using the security admin. So actually, for simplicity, we could also just use the account admin. This would work also. Otherwise, we would have to switch between different roles. So therefore, in our case, we would just make it simple and use the account admin. So first of all, again, we have set up this warehouse, and now we can also create the second warehouse, and this we can actually also do using the interface. So here we could navigate to the admin section. So you can see we find it under here, under admin. This is the admin section, which you can also see if you go to the main menu back. And here under admin, you can find the warehouses, and here you can create a new warehouse. So in this case, we can also say this is our DBA warehouse, and we could add a comment as well if we want. We can choose here the size and the type, and also in here auto resume, auto suspend after 5 minutes, for example. We don't want to set up a multi-cluster, and we want to leave all of the defaults like this. So here we can set up also our second warehouse. So we see we have now those two warehouses set up, and yeah, in our case now they are actually of the size. This one is extra small for the DBA, and if we refresh, we see we have also this data science with the size S. So now, of course, what we still need to do is we need to assign it to the users. We need to create the users and allow them to actually also access this warehouse. This is what we need to do. So therefore, let's navigate back to our worksheet. And in here, again, for simplicity, we now use the account admin because we have used that also to create this warehouse or these warehouses. And later on, we talk in more detail about the roles. So now here we want to just focus on what we have to do to assign a warehouse. So first of all, we would create a role. So we just use create role. This will just create the role setup, basically just the role itself without any permissions. And afterwards, we can grant usage on the warehouse. So here the name of the warehouse, and then to the role. Here is the role data scientist. And the same also we do for the DBAs. So let's select all of this, execute it, and we see those 4 commands will be executed. And now we of course have those roles, but we don't have any users set up yet. So therefore we can also set up users. So you can see this is also a simple command. We just create user, we say the name of the user, and then some properties like the password, login name, the default role. This is the role that will be selected when they log into their account. And then also we can assign a default warehouse. So then this will be the default warehouse that will be used for those users. And in some cases, of course, if we have set the auto resume to true, then this would automatically spin up this warehouse when this user is executing a query under this role. So we do this setting up here 3 users, and then afterwards we assign also the role to this user. So then they will have access to this role. So we do this by using grant role. So let's execute also those commands to set up those users and assign them their appropriate role. The same thing we can also do for the DBAs. And then of course we now want to test it. So of course, make sure to also drop this afterwards, which I will also do as well. But first of all, we would like to test it. And in here, I can now log into my account. So here, again, we have set up this like this. So we have, for example, this user. Let's say we have data scientist 1. I can just copy this name and also this password. So it's very simple, and I will of course drop it afterwards as well. So here we can see we have now logged in to this user, and yeah, we can select this mode. And here we cannot see any worksheets yet, but if we go to admin, we can go under warehouses, and we see that we have actually access to this warehouse. And if we would set up a new worksheet, we could also now use this warehouse. So in here, we can see that now this warehouse can be used. We have access to this under our role. And you see, this is our default role that is selected. Of course, the public role will always be assigned to any user that is created. And in this case, we also have this data scientist role. So this is how we can set up a dedicated warehouse and assign it to a role. And then we have to have the role also granted to our users. So like this, the users can use our warehouse. And of course, ideally, you will also, if you have worked along with me, drop all of the objects again. So most foundational way of modifying the performance, which is of course changing the size of our warehouse. So this is what we refer to as scaling up or scaling down, depending on whether we increase or decrease the size. So this is something that is a very important point, to choose the appropriate size of our warehouse. So this is something that we have to really think about depending on the workload, because on one side, we could just waste lots of resources if the warehouse is just too large. And on the other side, of course, if the users have to wait until the queries are returned, then this will also slow down the performance, and it will also not be an efficient way. So here we have to really think about choosing the appropriate size of our warehouse. So for example, we can have ETL processes. As we have already talked about, maybe they have a dedicated warehouse so that we can adjust the size exactly to the need of this workload. And here we might have also some, maybe less complex ETLs, and then we can choose a less large warehouse. And also when we have some changing workload, so sometimes we have, for example, here at certain hours, this ETL, and in this case, we might want to also change the size of the warehouse. So we could scale it down or scale it up. And also note that in this case, I'm mostly talking about the complexity of the queries. So this is the way that we address this complexity. And this is what we use scaling up and down for, depending on the complexity of the workload. Note that we are not talking here about more users, so more workload. This is rather where we would scale out in this case, but scaling up is more about the complexity of the query. So the existing workload, but just more complex. So this is scaling up, relatively basic. And now let's quickly also demonstrate this in our account, how we can scale up and how we can scale down an existing warehouse. So in this case, let's assume we have this compute warehouse. And of course, make sure you have the account admin selected so you have sufficient permissions. And if I want to modify the size, so I want to scale, for example, up, here we see this is currently extra small. I can just use the keyword alter and then the warehouse, of course. So that's what we want to alter. The name of the warehouse, in our case, it should be compute warehouse. Again, we can easily use autocomplete. And if we want to alter something, we can change properties. This means we use set, and then afterwards, what property we want to modify. So this is, of course, the warehouse size. So therefore, I'm choosing warehouse size, and now I can just modify it. So I can say, instead of extra small, I want to have just small. And if I execute it, this should now modify the size of the warehouse. You can see immediately it is also reflected. And if I want to do the same thing in also the interface, I can also do this under the admin section. So again, if I navigate to the main menu, you can see the admin section. Here we have also the warehouses, and I can now say here I probably have to refresh. So I see this is now modified, and in this case I can again modify this by clicking on these three dots. I say edit, and in here I can change also the size in the interface. So I can say I want to make this extra small, save it, and then we have this modified. So this is how we can scale up and down. And as we have mentioned, there is also another way that is more suitable if we have changes in the number of users mostly. So here we want to talk about scaling out. That's what we want to do in the next lecture.